Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Sunday, February 1st, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 80 degrees, with a low of 57.5 degrees, making for a mild winter day perfect for getting out and about. Coming up, we'll examine the motivations behind President Trump's choice to limit federal assistance to cities governed by Democrats, and unpack the reasons California's governor opted out of the recent Colorado River Governor Summit. Plus, we'll cover other key developments from around the nation and the world, including updates on global markets and local community initiatives. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We're starting this half hour with President Trump's new hands-off order for protests in Democratic-led cities. Reporter Ethan is with us. Ethan, in plain language, what did the president say he's going to do differently?
Grace, the president went on his Truth Social account last night, January 31st, and basically told his own government to stay out of protests in Democratic-run cities unless those cities specifically ask for help. According to ABC News, he singled out places like Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Chicago, Portland, and Washington, saying federal forces would not be used for general crowd control. In his words, he told Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, quote, "Under no circumstances are we going to participate in various poorly run Democrat cities with regard to their protests and/or riots unless and until they ask us for help," end quote. But at the same time, he told immigration and border agents to be, quote, "very forceful," end quote, in defending federal buildings from what he called, quote, "highly paid lunatics, agitators, and insurrectionists," end quote.
That sounds dramatic, but how much does it actually change what federal agents are doing on the ground?
Not very much, and that's a big point legal experts are making. Outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian, citing Associated Press analysis, note that federal immigration agents already had authority to operate in those cities without any invitation from local leaders. Laws that let them arrest people for immigration violations or protect federal property were already in place, and this new directive does not roll those powers back. So as NPR put it this morning, it is more of a rhetorical pivot than a real policy overhaul.
So if the legal powers stay the same, what's really behind this announcement right now?
Timing is everything here. According to NPR's U.S. News Roundup, this came just as the administration is under intense pressure over its massive immigration crackdown, something they call Operation Metro Surge. There have been weeks of protests, serious clashes, and some very high-profile fatal shootings of U.S. citizens in Minneapolis. Politically, the Arizona Daily Star points out that by saying he will not send extra help unless asked, Trump is trying to shift responsibility for any continued unrest onto Democratic mayors and governors.
Let's talk about that operation because it's driving so much of this. What exactly is Operation Metro Surge?
Operation Metro Surge launched in December of 2025 and is described by the administration as the largest federal immigration crackdown in U.S. history. DHS has deployed thousands of immigration and customs enforcement and border patrol agents into big cities, far from the traditional border zones, to go after people they label, quote, "criminal illegal aliens," end quote. By late January, according to ABC News, the government was touting more than 3,000 arrests. But NPR reports the operation started in Minnesota's Twin Cities and then spread, and it has swept up permanent residents and even U.S. citizens in the chaos, which is part of why anger is so intense there.
Why has Minneapolis, in particular, become the epicenter of this crisis?
Minneapolis is where some of the most disturbing incidents have happened, especially two fatal shootings of U.S. citizens that were caught on video and widely shared. Earlier this month, on January 7th, 37-year-old mother of three Renee Nicole Macklin Good was shot and killed by an ICE agent at an intersection in South Minneapolis. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem later called her a, quote, "domestic terrorist," end quote, and said she tried to run over agents, claiming the shooter was hospitalized with internal bleeding. But the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, and the Associated Press all verified bystander videos that show the agent firing 3 shots through her windshield as she drove away, with the car wheels turned away from him. And the Minneapolis Star-Tribune reports investigators never found evidence of those serious injuries he was said to have suffered.
And then there was another deadly shooting later in the month. What do we know about that case?
On January 24th, also in Minneapolis, 37-year-old Alex Jeffrey Preddy, a Veterans Affairs intensive care nurse and licensed gun owner, was shot multiple times by Border Patrol agents during a protest in the Whittier neighborhood. DHS initially claimed he was essentially a would-be assassin aiming to start a massacre and even showed off a pistol as proof. But video authenticated by the Associated Press, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal shows Preddy pinned to the ground by 6 agents, holding only his cell phone after being tackled and pepper-sprayed while trying to help another protester. Forensic reviews cited by NPR show an agent removing his handgun from a holster seconds before the fatal shots, and witnesses, including a pediatrician, say medical help was delayed, which is why the Justice Department has now opened a civil rights investigation into that shooting.
So these deaths happen, protests swell, and then we get this directive from Trump. How are analysts reading that connection?
People interviewed by NPR, including Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, say the directive looks like a kind of backhanded de-escalation signal. On paper, Trump is saying we will not flood your streets with more federal riot squads, like we did in Portland a few years ago. But by publicly limiting help to only what Democratic leaders request, he casts them as responsible for any continued chaos, while his immigration and property protection operations continue. The Arizona Daily Star described it as both a political challenge and a shield, so he can later say, they never asked us.
You mentioned that the legal powers for immigration raids and property defense aren't actually changing. Can you spell that out a bit more?
Sure. Federal agents doing immigration work operate under long-standing statutes that let them investigate smuggling, harboring, and visa violations, and those do not require state or local permission. Separate laws let them guard federal buildings, courthouses, and other facilities, and that is exactly the exception Trump carves out in this directive. What he is renouncing, at least rhetorically, is the broader use of federal agents as a kind of national riot police, unless local leaders invite that. He has not invoked the Insurrection Act, which would let him send troops in over state objections, so the New York Times notes that part is really just reaffirming the status quo.
How has Minnesota's state government responded to the surge and these shootings?
Minnesota officials moved quickly. On January 31st, State Attorney General Keith Ellison joined Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey and St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter in filing a federal lawsuit against the Trump administration. According to Associated Press reporting carried by ABC News, they argue the surge violates the 10th Amendment by trying to commandeer local police, and also tramples the First and Fourth Amendments by targeting sanctuary cities and using excessive force on protesters. A federal judge refused to grant them an emergency halt to the operation, even calling parts of the case legally weak, but she also said she had, quote, serious concerns, end quote, about the, quote, heartbreaking, end quote, impacts, and ordered DHS to preserve evidence after state investigators were blocked from some scenes.
That sounds like a pretty direct clash between state and federal power. What's the political temperature like between Minnesota leaders and the Trump team right now?
It is frosty, to put it mildly. Governor Walz told NPR he's deeply skeptical of what he called Washington's, quote, de-escalation talk, end quote, while thousands of heavily armed agents remain on Minnesota streets. The White House's border advisor, Tom Homan, has floated the idea of pulling some agents out if Minnesota law enforcement cooperates more closely with immigration arrests. But Ellison and local leaders have rejected that as a kind of quid pro quo. Meanwhile, Attorney General Pam Bondi is celebrating Trump's directive as a, quote, huge win, end quote, pointing to that judge's denial of an injunction as proof the operation is on solid legal ground.
Beyond courtrooms and politics, what's this doing to everyday life in those communities?
The word that keeps coming up in NPR's coverage is, quote, rattled, end quote. People in Minneapolis talk about avoiding parks, transit stops, even grocery stores, because they do not know when or where agents will appear. Schools have gone back to remote learning in some neighborhoods, and local businesses say revenue has plunged with streets emptied by fear and protest. There was also a leaked ICE memo reported by the Arizona Daily Star that expanded agents' ability to enter homes on administrative warrants, which a federal judge in Minnesota called, quote, coercive, end quote, and advocates say that has pushed families even deeper into hiding.
We've seen those images of crowds in the bitter cold. How big and how widespread are the protests now?
They are still sizable and very determined. NPR reported that as of 2 days ago, thousands of people were marching in Minneapolis for a second straight week, some braving sub-zero wind chills and using metal dumpsters as makeshift shields against tear gas near the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building. Demonstrations have spread to Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, and even Tucson, Arizona, where the Arizona Daily Star describes school closures and a noticeable ramp-up in local ICE activity. One small but powerful symbol has been these handmade, quote, melty ice, end quote, hats sold by a Minneapolis yarn shop modeled on World War II Norwegian anti-Nazi caps, with proceeds going to immigrant aid.
You've mentioned sanctuary city policies a couple of times. How do they factor into this fight over federal versus local control?
Sanctuary policies are really at the heart of this showdown. Cities like Minneapolis and Chicago limit how much they share immigration data or jail space with federal agents, and The Guardian notes that the lawsuit argues Operation Metro Surge is punishing those choices by focusing raids on so-called, quote, Democratic-led cities, end quote, and simultaneously withholding protest assistance. Legal scholars say Trump may be inviting equal protection challenges because it looks like the federal government is singling out jurisdictions based on their politics. Chicago's Mayor Brandon Johnson has already ordered investigations into what he calls potential, quote, illegal federal activity, end quote, on his city's streets.
And what about the national politics of this, in Congress and the campaign world?
In Washington, this is playing into already tense funding talks. According to the Wall Street Journal, Trump allies are casting the directive as proof the White House is being restrained and reasonable, even as they push for more money for immigration enforcement. Democrats are demanding stronger oversight of federal agents and tying that to funding negotiations, pointing to the Minneapolis shootings as evidence of abuse. Politically, Trump's message is that he is cracking down on illegal immigration while letting, quote, blue city, end quote, leaders own whatever chaos follows, a narrative his base is likely to hear on conservative media in the days ahead.
Legal experts keep calling this directive mostly symbolic. Is there any risk in that symbolism itself?
There can be. Outlets like Truth Out and Courthouse News quote constitutional scholars who say even a symbolic policy that openly targets, quote, Democrat cities, end quote, could undermine the norm that the federal government serves all states equally. It also normalizes the idea that basic public safety help might be withheld as leverage in political disputes. And while Supreme Court cases like Egbert versus Boulay have made it harder to sue individual agents, experts say cities and states can still bring broader claims under other federal laws if they can show patterns of discrimination or retaliation.
There's also the press freedom angle here. We've heard about the arrest of journalist Don Lemon in Minnesota. How does that fit into this picture?
Don Lemon, the former CNN anchor now working as an independent journalist, was arrested back on January 18th while covering a protest at a St. Paul church. NPR reports he has been indicted on charges that touch on religious freedom because authorities say he violated orders related to the church property, and his next hearing is set for February 9th. Supporters argue his case shows how aggressive policing around these protests can chill media coverage, especially when reporters are treated like participants rather than observers. It adds to a sense, among civil liberties groups, that both speech and assembly rights are under strain in cities targeted by the surge.
Looking ahead from this morning, what are the key things you'll be watching over the next week or two?
First, whether the Justice Department expands its civil rights investigation beyond the Alex Preddy shooting to include Renee Good's death, and that third, less publicized custody-related fatality. Second, how the courts handle Minnesota's lawsuit and similar challenges that other cities are preparing, especially any rulings that could rein in home raids or clarify limits on federal power inside sanctuary jurisdictions. And finally, whether the administration quietly changes the pace or visibility of Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis and other flashpoints, even if it does not say so publicly. As of this morning, according to NPR and the Associated Press, there has been no real drawdown in the roughly 3,000 agents deployed nationwide, so tensions are likely to stay high.
A lot to follow, and we know this will keep evolving day by day. Ethan, thanks for walking us through it all.
Thank you, Grace. I'll keep tracking the legal fights, the protests, and any shifts in how the administration actually enforces this directive on the ground.
We are following a high-stakes water showdown in Washington this week over the Colorado River, which keeps much of the Southwest alive. Reporter Chloe is with us to break down what happened and why California is right in the middle of it. Chloe, start us off. What was this big meeting in D.C. all about?
Earlier this week, on January 30th, the Trump administration pulled all 7 Colorado River Basin governors into the same room in Washington. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum hosted what he framed as a 2-hour governor-level summit to break a years-long stalemate over how to share a shrinking river after current rules expire at the end of this year. According to CalMatters, it is the first time governors themselves, not just water managers, have been convened directly by an Interior Secretary on Colorado River issues. And hanging over that meeting is a Bureau of Reclamation deadline in less than 2 weeks, on February 14th, for the states to deliver a voluntary deal before the federal government steps in with its own, potentially much tougher, cuts.
For listeners who are not water policy junkies, why is the Colorado River so important? And why has this become such a crisis?
The Colorado River is essentially the Southwest's lifeline. It supplies water to more than 40 million people, from Denver to Los Angeles, and irrigates huge farm regions like California's Imperial Valley, while also powering dams that generate electricity for millions, according to reporting from the Washington Post and the Water Education Foundation. Over the past decade, though, a mix of climate change, long-term drought, and simple overuse has pushed the system to the brink. Reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell are at historic lows, and experts warn they could approach so-called dead pool levels, where they cannot reliably release water or generate power if nothing changes.
You mentioned the current rules are expiring. What exactly has to be decided before the end of this year?
The river has been governed for a century by the 1922 Colorado River Compact, and a stack of later agreements that split it into an upper basin and a lower basin. The lower basin is California, Arizona, and Nevada, and the upper basin is Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. On top of that, there are the 2007 interim guidelines and the drought contingency plans signed in 2019, which lay out who takes which cuts in a shortage. Those newer rules run out at the end of this year, so the 7 states now have to agree on a post-2026 playbook for how to share pain in a river system that is delivering far less water than what was promised on paper.
And the states do not exactly agree on who should give up what, right?
Not at all. According to coverage compiled by Maven's Notebook, the lower basin states argue they have already taken the lion's share of voluntary reductions since those 2019 drought plans, giving up millions of acre-feet of water. They say the upper basin has to commit to firm cuts too, instead of relying on the fact that their use is limited by whatever snow happens to show up in the Rockies. Upper basin leaders counter that they have historically used less than their legal share, and worry that locking in fixed cuts could strangle their future growth. That basic tension has stalled negotiations for years.
Then earlier this month, the federal government put its own options on the table. What did the Bureau of Reclamation propose?
On January 9th, the Bureau released a draft environmental impact statement that lays out 5 possible federal approaches if the states cannot agree, according to CalMatters and Politico. Some of those options would tie how much water each state receives directly to real-world river flows, instead of fixed legal entitlements based on an over-optimistic century-old river estimate. Analysts say that could hit California especially hard because it is the largest single user in the basin and relies on about 4.4 million acre-feet from the Colorado every year, nearly 1/3 of its Colorado River supply. So for California, getting a state-crafted deal before the feds choose an option is critical.
Let's go back into that Washington meeting. With all of this on the line, was it a tense showdown or did it stay relatively calm?
People in the room describe it as intense but not explosive. Interior Secretary Burgum, who used to be governor of North Dakota, cast himself as a kind of referee, asking each governor for feedback on the federal options and encouraging one-on-one side conversations, according to CalMatters. Carla Nemeth, who runs California's Department of Water Resources, said afterward there was, quote, no new ground plowed, end quote, on the hardest issues, but still called the session useful. Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs told the Arizona Mirror and public radio station KJZZ that she saw, for the first time, an upper basin willingness to turn some of their water conservation programs from voluntary experiments into firm commitments, which she and Nevada officials both described as a meaningful, if modest, shift.
California is the biggest user on the river, but our governor was the only one not there in person. What happened with Governor Gavin Newsom?
That absence was one of the big storylines after the meeting. According to CalMatters reporter Rachel Becker, Newsom's office says he had a long-standing family commitment that conflicted with the January 30th session, and that California proposed alternate dates, but the Interior Department chose to move ahead anyway. On paper, that explanation is pretty mundane, but as the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post both point out, it landed in a highly charged political context. After the Trump White House had already barred Newsom from the United States Pavilion at the Davos World Economic Forum just a couple of weeks ago.
So did experts see Newsom's no-show as a snub of President Trump, or more of a calculated move?
Water law experts quoted in the Washington Post, like Arizona State University's Rhett Larson, say the optics are undeniably bad, because it let every other governor be photographed with the Interior Secretary while California's seat looked empty. Larson called it a potential snub that could irritate an administration already at odds with Newsom on climate policy and beyond. At the same time, some political analysts interpret it as strategic distance, designed to avoid what they call a Trump photo opportunity that could be spun as federal dominance over California. Under that reading, Newsom keeps leverage by staying out of the picture while still sending his top technical people to defend California's interests as the basin's largest user.
So who did California send instead? And what were they actually arguing for in that room?
California's bench was deep. The delegation included Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot, DWR Director Carla Nemeth, and J.B. Hamby, who chairs the Colorado River Board of California and is the state's lead negotiator. Nemeth told CalMatters their strategy was to show what she called an open hand. They spent a lot of time listening rather than delivering ultimatums, and they reiterated California's proposal from December of last year for roughly 1.5 million acre-feet of basin-wide cuts, shared among states. She said Newsom's guidance to the team was, quote, roll up your sleeves and be solutions-oriented, end quote, and to focus on building trust with upper basin leaders who have been wary of California's dominance.
You mentioned earlier this was unusual, having governors so directly involved. How different is that from how Colorado River deals have traditionally been made?
Historically, these agreements have been hammered out by technical experts, lawyers, and federal commissioners, not governors sitting around a table. The original 1922 compact was signed by state commissioners under then Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, and later deals like the 2007 guidelines and the binational agreements known as Minutes 319 and 323 were negotiated by water agency directors and the International Boundary and Water Commission, according to research aggregated by Maven's Notebook and Georgetown University water scholars. Even the high-profile 2019 drought contingency plans were signed at Hoover Dam by water officials like Nevada's John Ensminger, not by a full slate of governors. So this week's governor-level summit really underscores how stuck things are, and it also makes Newsom's absence stand out more, even though relying on expert delegates is actually the historic norm.
Some analysts have warned California could find itself isolated if it is not careful. What are they worried about there?
Commentators on Arizona PBS and in energy industry outlets note that fast-growing states like Arizona are tying their economic future to water-intensive technology sectors, including data centers and semiconductor manufacturing. If federal officials become convinced that California is dragging its feet, they warn Washington could be more sympathetic to upper basin arguments or to Arizona's push to protect high-tech growth and design post-2026 rules that squeeze traditional users like Imperial Valley agriculture harder. That is part of why California is trying so aggressively to present itself as cooperative and forward-looking, rather than as the entitled senior water rights holder. It is a delicate balance between defending long-standing legal rights and showing willingness to share sacrifice.
Let's fast forward to where things stand right now. Today is February 1st. After everyone left Washington, what did we learn about the state of the talks?
The phrase I keep hearing is a productive stalemate. There is still no grand bargain, but according to KJZZ and CalMatters, the Trump administration used the meeting to reiterate that February 14th deadline and floated the possibility of new federal funding to help cities and farmers who will be hit by conservation cuts. That kind of money has been a recurring request from states that say they cannot shoulder the economic losses alone. What has changed is less the substance than the tempo. Negotiators say phone calls and side meetings have ramped up significantly since the governors went home.
Within each half of the basin, are the states at least on the same page with each other?
In the lower basin, unity is unusually strong. California, Arizona, and Nevada are insisting that any new deal include mandatory, clearly defined cuts for everyone, not just voluntary pledges from some states, to avoid what they see as free riding, according to Nevada Current and Arizona Mirror coverage. Colorado's Attorney General Phil Weiser captured the upper basin sentiment from the other side when he told Colorado Public Radio, quote, "Colorado will not be a sucker," end quote, signaling they will not accept a plan that locks in big cuts for them while leaving others looser. Both basins, the Review Journal reports, are quietly building up legal war chests in case this all ends up before the Supreme Court instead of at a negotiating table.
If they miss that Valentine's Day deadline, what kind of federal actions could we be looking at?
If there is no state-led compromise by February 14th, the Bureau of Reclamation can move ahead and select or blend options from that draft environmental impact statement. Water policy experts interviewed by the Water Education Foundation and KUNC say some of those scenarios are, in their words, scary, because they would strictly tie deliveries to actual river flows in a way that quickly forces large, automatic cuts in dry years. For California, that could mean sudden reductions to the Colorado supplies that support Imperial Valley vegetable fields and help feed Southern California cities through canals, like the All-American Canal. It would also undercut hydropower revenues that have been helping pay to keep the entire system running.
Given those stakes, how is California trying to steer this away from the harshest federal options?
California's pitch is that it is willing to lead on reductions as long as cuts are truly shared and predictable. Officials like Wade Crowfoot and J.B. Hamby have emphasized, in interviews cited by CalMatters and Maven's Notebook, that California's December proposal already puts big voluntary reductions on the table, but they want corresponding enforceable commitments from the upper basin. They argue that kind of balanced basin-wide deal will protect everyone from more draconian, one-size-fits-all federal rules. In their telling, California is trying to act as a diplomatic anchor, holding the lower basin together while nudging the upper basin toward something more than pilot conservation programs.
Beyond water deliveries and electric bills, what are the broader risks if this drags on without a durable deal?
The most immediate risk is that reservoirs keep dropping over the next few years, especially if the next few winters bring weak snowpack. That would increase the chance of falling below levels needed to generate power at Hoover and Glen Canyon dams, and it would further damage river ecosystems that have already been hammered by warming and drought, problems highlighted in reporting by KUNC and the Water Education Foundation. There is also a longer-term governance risk. If the states cannot manage this river collaboratively, it strengthens arguments in Washington for much more assertive federal control over Western water. That is something states on both sides of the divide have traditionally tried hard to avoid.
After all of that, how did California's negotiators feel about making the trip to Washington, even though nobody came out waving a signed agreement?
Carla Nemeth told CalMatters the meeting was, quote, very worth our while, end quote, precisely because it elevated the conversation to the governor level and forced everyone to put their cards on the table. She said it opened the door to more direct conversations among states that will continue over the next few days, and that her team left with a clearer sense of where there really is room to compromise. She also described the pace of work between now and mid-February as, quote, pretty busy, end quote, which suggests we are likely to see more concrete proposals surface soon, even if there is not a single dramatic breakthrough moment.
For people listening in California this morning, what should they watch for over the next couple of weeks as this plays out?
The biggest signal will be whether the 7 states release some kind of joint framework before February 14th, even if the details still need to be filled in later this year. If, instead, we see competing press conferences or pointed letters from different governors, that may mean the Interior Department is preparing to move ahead with its own plan. And keep an eye on Governor Newsom's visibility. If he becomes more publicly involved in these talks, it will be a sign that the political stakes for California are rising even further as the deadline approaches.
A complicated story with a huge impact on the West. Chloe, thanks for walking us through it. Here are some other headlines. In the Middle East, saber rattling has become a full orchestral score. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned that any U.S. military strike would ignite a regional war as Washington sails more firepower into the Gulf, including the carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, ordered in after Tehran's lethal crackdown on protests Khamenei calls a foreign-backed coup. In a tit-for-tat that could make diplomacy a terror BLE ordeal, Iran's parliament has labeled all EU militaries terrorist organizations after the bloc blacklisted the Revolutionary Guard. Amid the brinkmanship, a rare bright spot, the Rafah border crossing has partially reopened under tight controls following the October 13 Gaza ceasefire, even as Israel says it is still dismantling remaining Hamas infrastructure. The ceasefire is holding, but with U.S. and Iranian forces on higher alert, the region feels one misstep away from trading cold peace for hot war and sending energy markets into a new spin. In Ukraine, the lights went out on the so-called energy ceasefire. A massive, cascading failure in the power grid knocked out electricity and water across much of the country and into neighboring Moldova, as a brutal cold snap plunged temperatures toward minus 30 degrees Celsius. Officials blame a technical malfunction on key 750 and 400 kilovolt lines, but years of weaponized winter have left the system hanging by a frayed wire. Kyiv's metro shut down for the first time in nearly 4 years because of low voltage, and the Chernobyl site briefly lost external power without triggering a safety crisis. All this comes during a pause in Russian strikes requested by President Donald Trump to clear the air, literally and figuratively, for peace talks in Abu Dhabi. Europe is trying to cushion the blow with emergency aid, including a €50 million loan to Naftagaz to keep the gas flowing and homes from becoming deep freezes. In Texas politics, the House got a little more crowded and a lot more contentious. Democrat Christian Menefee won the special runoff for the 18th Congressional District, taking about 67% of the vote against fellow Democrat Amanda Edwards to fill the late Sylvester Turner's Houston area seat. His arrival trims Republicans, majority to 218 to 214, leaving Speaker Mike Johnson counting noses like they're hanging chads. Menefee, the former Harris County attorney, signaled he's ready to Menefee ND, not mend, relations with the Trump administration, vowing to fight its immigration enforcement push. He'll serve through January 2027, but barely has time to hang his nameplate before facing a March primary for the full next term, after the district went nearly a year without representation due to the special election's timing. At Cape Canaveral, NASA is turning up the countdown and the drama. The space agency has kicked off a 48-hour wet dress rehearsal for Artemis II at Launch Pad 39B, filling the 322-foot Space Launch System with more than 700,000 gallons of super-cold fuel in a full launch day dress rehearsal. Heavy on the wet, no rockets actually, wed. The 4-person crew, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen, remains in quarantine, monitoring the test that must go off without a hitch before humanity returns to lunar flybys for the first time in 53 years. Bitter cold and strong winds have forced mission planners to pencil in, not ink in, the earliest launch window on February 8th, as Artemis aims not just to plant flags, but to plant the seeds of sustained deep space travel, a giant leap toward eventual crewed missions to Mars. And in global health, a parasitic scourge is on the brink of a wonderful ending. The Carter Center reports only 10 human cases of guinea worm disease worldwide in 2025, down from 15 the previous year, and light years from the 3.5 million annual cases when Jimmy Carter launched the eradication campaign in 1986. The remaining infections are confined to Chad, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, where insecurity in animal reservoirs are the last stubborn knots in the effort's fishing line. If successful, guinea worm would become just the second human disease ever eradicated after smallpox, and the first wiped out without a vaccine or medicine, proving that sometimes clean water, community work, and dogged persistence can outdrill even the nastiest of worms. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.